In this interview, I will be interviewing my mom. My mom is from Grand Junction, Colorado, and lived there until she moved to Ohio. In 1997, she moved to Ohio with my dad, who is originally from the area. When my mom was a kid, it was very different than what life is like for kids now. Life when my mom was a kid entailed different types of discrimination, more discrimination, and overall, just different ways of life that everyone lived. In this interview, we will be talking about racial discrimination, social class discrimination, and religious discrimination that occurred in both me and my mom's lives growing up. We will talk about these 3 different types of discrimination and how they affected us in different ways. After listening to the interview, you will be able to better understand the difference between how discrimination affects someone in my generation versus someone who is almost 2 generations older than me. You will just see how discrimination largely affected the lives of people back then and how it does not so heavily impact people of today's society, even though discrimination definitely still does exist towards different minorities. The interviewee will answer the questions honestly and thoroughly to give you the best idea of the types of discrimination that she saw and faced in her life while she was growing up as a young girl in Colorado. Have you ever had to protect me from stereotyping or discrimination when I was growing up in school or in my personal life?
No, not really. Growing up, you did not face much stereotyping or discrimination from anyone that I know of. Everyone around you growing up was very supportive. Even in school, your school was very accepting and allowed you to be yourself. You never really mentioned to me anyone facing discrimination around you either. For the most part, discrimination was not a big part of your life when you were growing up.
Have you ever experienced discrimination because of who you are? For example, because of how you speak your language, what religion you are, your partner that you choose, your accent that you have, where you were born, or anything else that you may be discriminated against for.
I experienced some discrimination when I was a kid due to my medical conditions. They were not severe conditions, but enough to bring some unwanted attention. Other kids didn't see me as equal or want to be around me sometimes because I looked different than them or did not have the same abilities. Besides the minor discrimination based on those medical conditions, I didn't face much other discrimination. I never really had any discrimination based on my language, religion, my partner, an accent, where I was from, or anything else like that.
When you are talking to people in your daily life, how do people usually react to the accent that you have?
I never really saw myself as having an accent, and nobody had ever pointed out that I have an accent that's noticeable to them until I moved to South Carolina. Now that I live in an area that has a very distinguishable accent, people tend to ask me where I'm from because I don't have the same accent as everyone else does that's from this area. I did grow up with some people that had an accent that was very different than mine, but since I grew up hearing it all the time, it didn't seem out of place to me. I think being around a different accent growing up made me be able to understand and accept accents better than some other people that I know in my life.
Did you notice discrimination going on around you growing up? If you did notice discrimination, what kind of discrimination occurred and how were they discriminated against?
One instance of discrimination that I can remember happening growing up was when an African American family moved into our town. This was the first time there had been any African Americans in the town that I lived in at all. They had children that were in high school at the same time I was in high school when they first moved into my town. The children moved from school to school in our town to try to find a good fit for them and their needs. They were the only African American family in town and in the school system in the area surrounding my town. Since they were the only ones, people looked at them differently than everyone else that was around them while they were in school. I really don't remember if the family ended up staying in town or not, but I feel that they definitely struggled to find a place where they felt accepted.
How much diversity was there in the town that you grew up in?
Growing up, the only racial diversity was the Hispanic population that was in my town. My town was probably about 30% Hispanic, and the rest were all white Americans. There was little to no racial diversity in my town besides this little population of Hispanic people that were in the area until the African American family moved into town. There was some social diversity in the area when I was growing up. Kids were either from the suburbs or from the farming community. The suburb kids tended to be from a much wealthier upbringing than the kids from the farming community were.
Were people around you growing up accepting of diversity in race, religion, social class, or other types of diversity?
People around me growing up were pretty accepting of diversity that I was aware of. The only way that the people around me were not always accepting of diversity was when it came to the social classes. I remember seeing some discrimination based on what material things the wealthier kids had over those that the farming community kids did not. Besides that discrimination, most people were pretty accepting of all the people around us in the town.
Was there any religious discrimination against a specific group that occurred against anyone that lived in your town? If there was religious discrimination against someone for their beliefs, what religion were they? And how were they discriminated against in your town?
There was a large Mormon population in my town. I do remember that they had a much stricter lifestyle than other people appeared to. The kids tended to group together at school. Not that they were excluded from other groups, though. I think they just felt more comfortable together. I had a close friend that was a Mormon, actually, and I recall one time I went as her guest to a dance held at her church. It was a different experience for me as compared to other dances I had been to, for sure. I was dancing to a slow song with a boy when someone came up and put a Bible between us, as if to say we were dancing too close. I felt a little uncomfortable after that, like they thought I was a bad influence on him or something. It certainly didn't impact the friendship that I had with the girl, but I never went to another dance there.
Since I went to a Catholic school for pretty much all of my life, did you ever notice other kids that were non-Catholic in the school that got discriminated against while I was in school? If you ever saw any first-hand discrimination, how were they discriminated against, and did anyone notice?
When you were in Catholic school, no matter your religion or what you believe in, you were required to take their religion class that was offered at the school, and you were required to participate in prayers and other religious activities that the school had. The school was overall pretty accepting of people with other religions. but still required them to participate in the Catholic practices. None of the kids that were non-Catholic were ever discriminated against by students or faculty that worked at the school. The students were accepted for the religion that their parents or themselves had chosen to practice. They were never required or forced to receive sacraments of Catholic faith, but they were required to attend Mass with the rest of the school. Some parents were not fond of their children having to attend Mass at a Catholic school when they were not Catholic, but most of them got over that or understood the position that the school was taking on the matter. In middle school, all of the students were not as pressured as they were in high school. In high school, there was more opportunities to get involved in Catholic practices, and it was more prominent in everyday life. I know from what you have told me that some people were uncomfortable by the way that everyone was preaching about being Catholic all the time. When you were in Catholic school, no matter your religion or what you believe in, you were required to take their religion class that was offered at the school, and you were required to participate in prayers and other religious activities that the school had. The school was overall pretty accepting of people with other religions, but still required them to participate in the Catholic practices. None of the kids that were non-Catholic were ever discriminated against by students or faculty that worked at the school. The students were accepted for the religion that their parents or themselves had chosen to practice. They were never required or forced to receive sacraments of Catholic faith, but they were required to attend Mass with the rest of the school. Some parents were not fond of their children having to attend Mass at a Catholic school when they were not Catholic, but most of them got over that or understood the position that the school was taking on the matter. In middle school, all of the students were not as pressured as they were in high school. In high school, there was more opportunities to get involved in Catholic practices, and it was more prominent in everyday life. I know from what you have told me that some people were uncomfortable by the way that everyone was preaching about being Catholic all the time. Non-Catholic students had a harder time getting through this Catholic school due to them not fully understanding the religion and being pressured by outside sources to understand what was going on in a religion they did not practice. Most kids who are non-Catholic did not go to Catholic school before they came to your high school, and they were even farther behind than some of the Catholic students. They found it harder to understand religion classes and successfully get through them.
In this interview, we have realized that both of us had had very little exposure to discrimination throughout our lives. We have not experienced people getting discriminated against or being discriminated against ourselves very much in our entire lives. The interviewee did not have a lot of exposure to diversity growing up, but I did have a lot of exposure to diversity. That is one way that we differ in our ways of growing up with people around us. I always grew up with people of all different races, backgrounds, and religions. The interviewee did not grow up with the same experiences that I did. In this interview, I realized that everyone has different experiences and no one lives the same life that you live. Everyone gives different amount of exposure to different life experiences that make them who they are and help them to understand the world that is around them.